This is episode 140 of That Shakespeare Life. That Shakespeare Life is now available on our very own digital app. This app works on your tablet, phone, or TV and lets you explore the history of William Shakespeare with exclusive content, interviews, and documentaries not available anywhere else. You can cook, dance, and play your way through the life of William Shakespeare, all without any commercials. Find out more at castycash.com/experience and stay tuned after the episode for even more details.
Hi. I'm Ralph Goldswain, author of No Sweat Shakespeare. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend, Cassidy Cash.
Shakespeare was a common enough name in the area, so we just have to assume, I think, that he'd moved to Snitterfield not all that long before. We can be pretty sure that it was in Snitterfield that John was born and spent his childhood. I mean, even the location of his father Richard's farmstead has been identified. The site's occupied today by a substantial property. I think it's known as Park View. It's partly timber framed, and though it's extended later, it would once have housed the Shakespeare family.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
William Shakespeare's father was a man named John Shakespeare. When you study William's life, you often hear about John Shakespeare, as many references to glove making in Shakespeare's plays, like the Glover's Paring Knife and Merry Wives of Windsor, come from an intimate knowledge with the glove-making trade, which most historians assume came from William's father, John. When it comes to the life of John Shakespeare, however, the man was much more than a glover, having served also as an ale taster, alderman, and found himself embroiled in a great deal of legal and financial trouble that some historians believe contributed to our lack of records for Shakespeare's grammar school days. To help us understand John Shakespeare better and explore the records we have of his life and how he came to be the father of the world's greatest playwright, we welcome our guest, Bob Bearman, to tell us John's story. Bob Bearman was the head of archives at Shakespeare Birthplace Trust from 1970 to 2007, and is a fellow of the Royal Historical Society, honorary fellow at Shakespeare Birthplace Trust, honorary research fellow at the School of History at University of Birmingham, general editor for publications of the Dugdale Society, editor of the Warwickshire History, and a member of the editorial board of Midland History. Bob is the author of several books on Shakespeare, including Shakespeare's Money, which was published in 2016 and features John Shakespeare, which is the topic Bob joins us to discuss today. Find a list of Bob's books and publications, as well as more information and resources in the show notes for today's episode. Hello, Bob. Welcome to the show.
Hello. Well, thank you for inviting me on.
Did John Shakespeare grow up in Stratford-upon-Avon?
Well, if we're talking about his childhood, then no, I don't think he did. Having said that, exactly when he was born or even where, we can't be absolutely certain either. Later in the century, that's the sort of thing you could have worked out from parish registers. But these only date at the earliest from 1538. And even so, only very few survive from as early as that anyway. Most begin, or at least those that survive do, from when Queen Elizabeth came to the throne in 1558. So for anyone born before then, it's only in exceptional cases, really, that we know when they were born, or at least when they were baptised. But we do know that John's father, Richard, was a well-to-do husbandman who'd been farming various parcels of land in the village of Snitterfield, a few miles to the northeast of Stratford. And he'd been there since at least 1528, not as a freeholder, but as a tenant or copyholder on two manors there. And he died early in 1561. Now, exactly how long the family had been there, we just don't know. Probably not all that long, though, as there's no mention of Richard in earlier Snitterfield records. But Shakespeare was a common enough name in the area, so we just have to assume, I think, that he'd moved to Snitterfield not all that long before. We can be pretty sure that it was in Snitterfield that John was born and spent his childhood. I mean, even the location of his father Richard's farmstead has been identified. The site's occupied today by a substantial property. I think it's known as Park View. It's partly timber framed, and though it's extended later, it would once have housed the Shakespeare family. Now, of course, John and his parents would have known Stratford. A market was held there every week, well within reach. And this is where his parents would have taken any surplus agricultural produce to sell and to purchase items which were either made in town by specialist craftsmen or sold on by retailers dealing in manufactured goods. And as to when John was born, this can really only be a best guess, but we know he died in 1601. If he'd reached the age of 75 by then, that would have been unusual, but would give us 1526 as a rough date or best guess, more or less the same time as his father is first recorded in Snitterfield.
How do we know precisely when he decided to relocate to Stratford-upon-Avon? Obviously, we know he was familiar with it, and we know he ended up settling there because that's where William Shakespeare was born. But do we know anything about when he decided to make that his home?
Well, from at least 1556, we know that John was trading as a glover in the town. And this certainly implies that to learn the trade, he must have spent some years as an apprentice in the household of a glover, most likely in Stratford. And if this apprenticeship had been for the usual 7 years, that would place John in the town by 1548 at the very latest. But we also know that in April 1552, when in fact he first appears in Stratford's written records, he and 2 other men were fined 12 pence each for making a muck heap in Henley Street instead of taking their refuge to an authorised one at the top of the street. Now, he could hardly have still been an apprentice to have caused such a nuisance. Even more important, it was in Henley Street that 6 months later, John bought the freehold of a property, perhaps one that he'd been renting earlier. And again, there's no way that somebody recently apprenticed would have been able to take such a step. So if we think of John being born, as I suggested, in 1526, he would have been around 26 in 1552. That's still quite young for him to buy a house, especially as his father was actually still alive. But as to the date he moved to Stratford, and assuming, of course, he served his apprenticeship of 7 years, this would be about right. That is, if he was born in 1526, he could have been apprenticed at the usual age of 14 or so in, say, 1540, and then had become a freeman at the very latest in 1547 at the age of 21. And this would then have allowed him at least 5 years or so to build up sufficient resources to buy a house.
You mentioned that the records didn't get as well documented as we have them for later periods until Elizabeth. So do we have records of John and Mary Shakespeare's marriage?
Well, no, we don't have that either, but actually we can pin that down a bit more closely. John Shakespeare's wife was Mary Arden, but she was still single in November 1556 when her father, Robert Arden of Wilmcote, mentioned her by her maiden name in his will. On the other hand, John and Mary's first child was baptised on the 15th of September 1558, implying, I think, that they had married about a year earlier. And this then ties in very nicely with what we've already discussed. Young men across the board were expected to first to establish themselves as independent of their parents, and then to have served out an apprenticeship in order to pursue a trade, and then to set themselves up with an establishment of their own. And all this had to be done before they married, so as to provide a financially secure platform for raising a family. And this tended to delay the age of first marriage amongst men to at least mid-20s, if not later. And their wives were usually a year or two younger. So in other words, if John was born in 1526, he would have been around 31 when he married. He could have been younger, though this would have allowed him less time to get established in the town. And one final point, Mary Arden was quite a good catch. She was fatherless by the end of 1556, but had just inherited from her father considerable property in Wilmcote. another village near both Stratford and Snitterfield. In fact, Robert, it turns out, was one of Richard Shakespeare's landlords in Snitterfield. So if Richard had managed to get his son John married to his landlord's now fatherless daughter, this was quite an astute move.
Now, despite not having many records to definitively nail down John Shakespeare's life, I think we do have a record that indicates John Shakespeare was appointed to the position of town ale taster in Stratford-upon-Avon in 1556. Bob, explain for us what an ale taster does, and was this a prestigious appointment for John Shakespeare?
Well, the ale taster actually was a minor office holder in the service of the Stratford Corporation, so not particularly prestigious at that point. The corporation was a body set up by charter in 1553 to manage many aspects of local government in the town. And the ale taster's main job was to supervise the production of bread and ale. This had been a subject from medieval times to what was known as the assize of bread and ale, which regulated prices according to the cost of wheat, barley and oats. Stratford appointed 2 ale tasters at the court leet held in October each year, and John was chosen one of them for the year 1556-7. Ale tasters, as I said, were very much junior post holders amongst the corporation's personnel, but the real significance of John's appointment was that by then he must have been of sufficient repute, I think, in the town's business world to have attracted the corporation's attention. In fact, in the previous August, he'd been sworn as one of the local court's jury, which would never have happened if the corporation hadn't already earmarked him as a potential recruit. And if by our calculations he was by then around 30 years old, that would also tally well with the age of others recruited to serve the corporation. And the next step up from that appointment would be one of the town's 4 constables. Again, they usually served for 2 years. And John was sworn in for the years 1557-8 and 1558-9. And this, in turn, made him a candidate for promotion to the rank of capital burgess. They were the 14 men who formed the lower tier of the official governing body. There's a break in the order book at this point, so we don't quite know when he made it that far, but 1560, after his term as constable, would be what we would expect. In any case, he was appointed Chamberlain or Treasurer in October 1562, and that was a post that was almost always reserved for men of capital burgess rank. And when the order book resumes, we find him listed consistently in this way until his promotion to the upper tier as alderman in September 1565, and then taking his turn as High Bailiff in 1568-9.
You alluded to this earlier, that John Shakespeare is most often, when people talk about Shakespeare's father, they describe him simply as a glover. But with all these other civic duties, which seem to be quite a lot of rising through the ranks that he did, I'm assuming intentionally, was John Shakespeare frequently changing jobs during his lifetime? Or is this variety of occupations simply because we're examining a man's entire life at once and you find the many professions that are there?
Well, is it really a matter of changing jobs? John Shakespeare is described as a glover, or the related trade a widower, on 5 occasions. And that's between 1562 and 1592. So there isn't really any doubt that this was the only trade that he was trained for or apprenticed in. But another description applied to him was yeoman or farmer. In fact, this occurs more often than glover, 7 times actually over more or less the same period. This can partly be explained, at least until the late 1570s, by the fact that he would have been responsible for farming the land at Wilmcote, which his wife Mary Arden brought with her when she married him. And John also enjoyed a share in the land which his father Richard had farmed in Snitterfield and in the neighbouring hamlet of Ingan. So, like many artisan craftsmen, John was one of those apprentice townsmen who also had backup interests in working the land. So in answer to your question, it's not really a matter of changing jobs, but of setting himself up in Stratford as a specialist artisan, but not letting go of a way of life which he had inherited from his forebears. And don't forget, we also know that he dealt in wool, which is what later got him into trouble. He could have become involved in this business either because he grazed sheep on land he farmed, or from sheepskins, which came his way as a glove maker, or both. So it's not really a matter of changing jobs, but recognising that the three occupations of yeoman, glover, and widower could be interlinked. But as to the issue of how it was that he was willing to give up some of his time in serving the corporation, this might be looking at it the wrong way round. The members of the town council, both the aldermen and capital burgesses, were named by the Crown in the town charter of 1553, and not surprisingly, were made up of the town's principal tradesmen, or as the charter defines them, the better and more upright and discreet men of the town. And when a vacancy occurred amongst the aldermen, the remaining 13 chose a successor from the capital burgesses. And this in turn would mean that a new capital burgess had to be recruited again from the better and more discreet freemen of the borough. So in effect, this became rather like a self-perpetuating oligarchy, inevitably reflecting the business interests of its members. So it's not surprising that there was competition amongst the business community to get selected. I mean, I'm not saying that all these better-off townsmen were motivated only by self-interest, and there were certain costs attached to being a member of the governing elite. But on the other hand, the fact of being bound together by their common status as business figures was bound to reflect their views on how the town should be run. And there were ways of making a bit of money too. They could, for instance, offer in quotes, to supply goods and services for work that the corporation was engaged on. Or they could take on favourable leases of corporation properties, not for their own use, but to sublet at a profit.
You mentioned John Shakespeare dealing in wool, and I would like for you to explain to us a phrase that comes up in the official records listing John Shakespeare's dealing in wool. They use the phrase wool brogger, and that means that John Shakespeare was dealing in wool at least in the 1570s when this appears. But Bob, explain the situation here for us. What is a wool brogger, and does this mean that the Shakespeare family owned sheep on some of this land that he had inherited?
Well, John's involvement in glove making through the use of sheepskin would have meant that he would be left with quite a lot of wool on his hands, plucked from the hide of the dead sheep. I mean, who knows, it could even have been, as you suggest, from some of his own sheep grazing on his land at Wilmcote and Snitterfield, which would have provided him with shorn wool as well. And this is all a bit circumstantial, I know, but John could just as easily have purchased his sheep skins from the butchers who slaughtered the sheep. Either way, though, it's clear that glovers, especially widowers, could end up at least with a quantity of fell wool, which could just be sold on. Why this was the case was because that softer skins, sheep skins, but also deer skins and goat skins, were not tanned in the official way or in the usual way to make heavy-duty leather for things like shoes, belts, or buckets, but were tawed instead by a widower into a softer, paler leather to be used for more sophisticated products such as upmarket gloves. And this white leather, as it was called, was then often pared to the necessary thickness to soften it. So that's the way that a glover could become possessed of a quantity of fell wool, as it was called. Either way, I mean, whether he was a glover or acting as a widower, you could end up at least with a quantity of fell wool which could just be sold on. Some glovers got more involved in wool trading than that. They could also become middlemen or brokers, hence the term brogger, for shorn wool as well. Now, the major wool merchants, the merchants of the staple, dominated the wool trade, buying their shorn wool from the owners of vast flocks of sheep and then selling it on, mainly for export. But broggers acted as small-scale middlemen, especially on behalf of owners of smaller flocks, after first getting into the business by selling their own fell wool. And dealing in shorn wool as well, even in a small way, could prove remarkably profitable. And in 1568, for example, we find John allegedly involved in a transaction concerning his sale of 21 tods of wool. That's nearly 600 pounds in weight. And 3 years later, in 2 similar sales, totaling the astonishing quantity of 300 tods, that's 8,400 pounds, which would have placed him quite high, I think, in the ranks of Midlands wool dealers. We only know of these deals as a result of legal cases when exaggerated sums were always being bandied about. But they do at least establish that John was into wool dealing in a fairly big way.
Was this wool dealing what ended him in financial trouble? I know that when we look at Shakespeare's life, we don't know for sure, but one of the things they say about Shakespeare is that he may have left grammar school as a result of his family's financial issues. What happened to land John Shakespeare in this kind of financial trouble?
Well, that's still a matter of debate. But technically speaking, what John was doing actually contravened an Act of Parliament of 1552, which had restricted the sale of wool either direct to manufacturers or woolen goods or to the merchants of the staple. And this act had been passed when prices were high and was designed by cutting out the middlemen or the bloggers to protect the interests of the big merchants who are finding it difficult, of course, to export wool at those prices. But when prices fell, nobody was too worried about enforcing this rule. In any case, enforcement depended on informants, as they were known, who stood to gain even just by threatening to report alleged offenders to court. And if this out-of-court blackmail didn't work, and if the court case then went against the defendant, the informant was still up for a reward instead. And this, in fact, is what happened to John, who fell victim to one of these informants, the notorious James Langrake. First in 1570, Langrake reported John for an offence against another statute, lending money at more than the rate of interest, that was 10%, that the law allowed. But he followed this up 2 years later by accusations that John had also been involved in those two wool sales I've just mentioned, which as only a blogger, he shouldn't have been. Langrake's dubious activities later got him into trouble, leading in 1574, first to his imprisonment, and then to a ban preventing him from bringing any more informations, as they were called. But however exaggerated or misleading we think Langrake's accusations were, they do at least establish that John was indeed a wool grogger. But whether it was these legal actions that pushed John over the edge, I think is still debatable. Certainly by the mid-1570s, when wool prices were again on the rise, the government did take further action against wool bloggers in order to protect the interests of the merchants of the staple. And it could have been this pressure, rather than those allegations of 5 or 6 years earlier, which had an effect on John's business interests. On the other hand, surely he should have been able to fall back on his glover's trade to tide him over. Instead, though, there are clear indications from the late 1570s that he had run into serious trouble. And this suggests to me, actually, that in lending money and wheeling and dealing in wool, he just overreached himself and run out of credit, even more disastrous than it is now. But the details of this are still under discussion. Glyn Parry, who you may have heard of, has recently uncovered additional documents which throw more light on John's involvement with the courts at this time. And these are discussed in a new book, actually, which he's just co-authored, but which I haven't read yet because it's only just come out.
It's always surprising to me that after years of suffering what seems like extensive financial trouble and being brought to court and accused of these things in an official way, that by 1596, John Shakespeare is granted an official coat of arms. Bob, how is it possible that a man so slandered and nearly bankrupt is able to be granted an official coat of arms? I would give credit to William Shakespeare's success as a playwright by this time, but seeing as the coat of arms was given to William's father and not William, I'm confused. Bob, please explain this process for us. And how is John Shakespeare able to be made a gentleman?
Well, I think you're quite right to suspect that William might have been behind the grant of arms. And what's more, also behind the general improvement in John's fortunes at around that time. Now, whether this really was the case, and if it was, why William should have bothered to get involved, does require a bit of speculation, and various suggestions have been put forward. But I think the major clue lies in William's purchase of New Place in 1597. That's the second largest house in Stratford. And this must have been involved in considerable outlay. And we can take it surely as an indication that by then he must have been financially secure. And it was in a year or two either side of this that, one, the grant of arms was made, two, that John sought to recover his wife's land at Wilmcote, and three, when John revived a case 30 years old to recover a debt of £21. And all this points to an attempt to set the family back on its feet, ostensibly in the name of John Shakespeare, but with William probably pulling the strings in the background. After all, John was probably already well into his 70s and unlikely to have wanted to travel down to London to start up negotiations with the heralds or get involved in any legal wrangles. And if we accept that William was behind all this, it's not really a surprise that the grant was initially made to his father. I mean, John was, after all, still head of the family. And William would have known that the coat of arms would pass to him on his death. But in that case, we would have to accept that William was doing all this because he believed he somehow saw it as his duty. And here, of course, we enter the world of further speculation. But I don't think it's stretching the evidence too far to propose the very time in the late 1570s when he'd witnessed his father's financial undoing, he'd made things worse, contrary to what nearly everybody else did, by marrying while still in his teens and adding to the family's problems by introducing a wife and 3 children to its complement, but with no means of his own to support them. And he might since have made good, but I see his first venture into real estate by buying a new place as showing a determination to make it clear as soon as he had the means that his family, if you like, had recovered its status in his native town, and that he may have done this even as an act of reconciliation with his father, who in William's mind at least he had let down in the 1570s.
Well, how did John Shakespeare's life end? Do we know where he died or where he's buried today?
Well, John was buried on the 8th of September 1601. He'd probably only died 2 or 3 days before. Being summer, the family wouldn't have wanted to delay interment for longer than that. We don't know the nature of any final illness, but the burial rate that winter was no higher than usual, or autumn and winter. If it had been, we could at least have suggested an epidemic of some sort. Instead, John, well into his 70s by then, was more likely to be carried off by an illness that a younger person might well have fought off. He was buried in Stratford, if the parish register is to be believed. He was entered there as Master John Shakespeare. The word master was in recognition of his former status of alderman and bailiff. But we might note, I suppose, that the vicar or his clerk, either accidentally or deliberately, had chosen this description rather than gentleman, which he would have been entitled to after the grant of arms 5 years earlier, and was how members of other arms-bearing families were described in the burial register. Perhaps the message just hadn't sunk in, or perhaps Billa hadn't even been aware of it. We don't, of course, know whether William was at the burial. If he had to be sent for, this could have taken 4 days at the absolute minimum. If John made a will, he hasn't survived, so we don't know whether he requested burial within the church or simply in the churchyard or just in the earth, as his son did. Quite a few will makers did make the request that they should be buried in the church, though very few, if any, gravestones or monuments survived to confirm whether this actually happened. So in John's case, we just don't know, though I suspect burial simply took place in the churchyard.
So we don't actually have his grave. You can't visit John Shakespeare's grave there at Stratford-upon-Avon?
No, you can't. No.
We just know that it's there somewhere. Well, I know we would love to know more about John Shakespeare. What are some of your favorite books or resources which you can recommend we use to learn more?
I think Park Honan's biography, Shakespeare and Life, goes into his business dealings in quite some detail, more detail than some people who've written since. So I think that would be a good starting point. I'm afraid I can't omit to mention my own book, Shakespeare's Money, in 2016, which goes into this in much more detail. In fact, would help to back up some of the things I've said today. And also, I mentioned Glyn Parry. Well, he's just co-authored a book, Glyn Parry and Catherine Ennis, Shakespeare Before Shakespeare, Stratford-upon-Avon, Warwickshire and the Elizabethan State, which is OUP 2020. It is only just out, and I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but I'm sure, due to his discoveries of more activity on John's part, that's going to add to our knowledge. And just finally, I believe Lena Orlin is working on a biographical study involving a great deal of local material, so I'm sure she'll have something to say as well. So look out for her book in due course.
We will link to all of these resources in the show notes for today's episode, where you can find more about them as well as more about Bob. So make sure that you visit the show notes to find those. Bob, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible. So your choice would be in addition to those.
Right. Well, it would need to be long. Not only say it took a long time to read, but long enough so that when I read it again, I would have forgotten much of the detail, if not the story. And one of the books I've always meant to read but haven't got round to is Samuel Richardson's Clarissa. But can I make it one of the early editions, please? It started off in 7 volumes, which would make a convenient place to break off and read a Shakespeare play or book of the Bible in the meantime.
Absolutely. I think that's an excellent choice. You'll be well set up on your deserted island. So what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Well, I'm just finished putting the finishing touches to volume 7 of the Minutes and Accounts of the Stratford Corporation from 1610 to 1620. It will be in succession to Minutes and Accounts volume 6, which I edited a few years ago, covering the years 1600 to 1610. The original idea of that project was to print all the minutes and accounts of the period when Shakespeare and his family were active in the town. And volume 1 was published in 1920, so it's taken 100 years for us to get to 1620. I've got an article on the Welcome Enclosures in which William Shakespeare was involved, which is going through the mill at the moment, and also another article on the Stratford Church Court, or Bawdy Court as it was called, which was held in the late 16th, early 17th century, which again mentions the members of Shakespeare's family.
Those sound very exciting. We'll look forward to seeing those come to fruition. Bob Bearman, thank you so much for being here with us this week and helping us walk through the life of John Shakespeare. This was a really fun conversation.
Well, thank you very much.
Find links to the resource Bob's mentions today, as well as historical and archival images related to the life of John Shakespeare in the show notes for today's episode. Packed with more history and even more about William Shakespeare, you can find all the good stuff at castycash.com/episode 140. That's castycash.com/EP140. Don't forget to enter your email while you're there inside the show notes to download a hand-illustrated print of Stratford-upon-Avon, John Shakespeare's hometown, while you're there. This week's episode does not have a video recording, but you can find video versions of several of our episodes here on the show by visiting the app at castycash.com/experience. That's castycash.com/experience. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.